In today's talk, I will be focusing on the Russian attack on Ukraine, how to understand it and what we can learn from it. I will demonstrate how the past shapes the present, how views about history influence decision-making, and how history is used and manipulated in political discourse. I will engage with popular misconceptions about the reasons for the Russian attack, why experts getting it wrong, and that it is important for historians to publicly fight against the manipulation of history and the distortion of facts. But let's begin with a few words about Russia's place in and outside of Europe. Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and initially Putin considered Russia to be European. Most Russian intellectuals in the 19th and 20th century would have considered Russia as part of Europe. Gorbachev also spoke of the common European house, and there were attempts to create a European security architecture with Russia. Initially, Putin also made some positive references to Europe and of Russia being part of Europe. In 2000, while visiting London, Putin stated, quote, "Russia is a part of European culture, and I do not consider my own country in isolation from Europe," end of quote. Either his views have changed, or he now says openly what he was hiding when he came to power. Today, Putin questions Russia's Europeanness and considers it a world of its own. According to Putin and his ideologists, Russia is a distinct civilization, a Russian world. This has political consequences to which I will come back later. Now let's move on to the war. If you are following the news about the Russian war against Ukraine, you will have listened to many attempts of journalists, politicians, and historians to explain what motivated Putin to attack. You will have learned that there are different ways to frame the war. Some analysts explain the attack as a response to the expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe, motivated by Russian fears about their security. Others see it as an attempt to reverse the disintegration of the Soviet Union and restore Russia's hegemony over Eastern Europe. Others again view it as part of a global struggle between democracy and dictatorship. What most of these explanations have in common is that they try to find the reasons in recent history, reaching back to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. While the last 30 years are important, and I will come back to them later, I believe that the attack on the sovereignty of Ukraine has deeper historical roots. At the same time, I would like to emphasize that looking for historical explanations does not mean that uncontrollable historical forces made this clash inevitable. It was Putin and his entourage who made the decision. It was their misguided interpretation of Russian interests which prompted them to wage war against their Western neighbor. They are also responsible for how the war is fought, for the war crimes committed by the Russian army. To make it clear from the start, the Russian attack on Ukraine is not only breaking international law, but also questioning the inviolability of state borders on which European peace is based. Russia wages war on a sovereign state with the intention to annex part of its territory. The only other such case in the last decades I'm aware of is when Saddam Hussein attacked Kuwait with the intention to make it part of Iraq. Putin often refers to the Second Iraq War as a precedent set by the USA and Britain. If they can break international law, why should Russia not break it? And indeed, the legal justifications of the second invasion of Iraq are dodgy. 2 points to keep in mind. It was not the West's or NATO's war. France and Germany were opposed to it and did not participate. And it was not a war intending to annex territory or destroy the Iraq nation. The Russian attack on Ukraine, however, is a war directed against the very existence of the Ukrainian nation and an independent Ukrainian state. I will now engage with Putin's thinking, his perception of Ukraine and her history and of the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. There is a long tradition among the Russian political elite of opposing the very idea of the existence of a Ukrainian nation. Like his imperial predecessors, Putin believes that Great Russians, Ukrainians and Belarusians are three branches of the Russian people, meaning that they all are essentially Russians. Putin considers Ukrainian territory and the Ukrainian people to be part of Russia. In the 19th century, Russian imperial authorities referred to Ukrainians as Little Russians. Their language, called a Little Russian dialect, was considered a corrupted form of Russian. The Russian authorities fought the Ukrainian national movement and suppressed publications in Ukrainian. Russians, Belarusians and Ukrainians trace their origins back to the Kievan Rus, or in the Russian pronunciation, the Kievan Rus. The Kievan Rus was a large and influential medieval principality, mostly inhabited by East Slavic tribes. It was founded by Viking warrior traders along the river Dnieper and was part of the trade route from Scandinavia to Constantinople. In the year 988, Grand Prince Vladimir in Russian, of Kiev and his East Slavic subjects were baptized. They took their form of Christianity from Byzantium, not from Rome, and became part of the Orthodox Christian world. In 2013, Putin addressed a conference in Kiev celebrating the 1025th anniversary of the baptism of the Rus. Quote Putin, "This is not just Ukraine's civilizational choice. Here, at this site, at the baptismal site on the Dnieper River, a choice was made for the whole of Holy Rus, for all of us. When I say for our entire people, we know today's reality, of course, know that there are the Ukrainian people and the Belarusian people, and other peoples too. And we respect all the parts of this heritage, but at the same time, at the foundations of this heritage are the common spiritual values that make us a single people. In medieval times, Ukraine was part of first one and then another European power center, came under the rule of one country, then another. But the vision of uniting both the western and eastern parts of Rus, so western Belarus and Ukraine, eastern part the Muscovite state, the state that had its beginning here in Kiev, always lived on in the east and in the west, wherever our people lived. Let me say again that we will respect whatever choice our Ukrainian partners, friends and brothers make. The question is only one of how we go about agreeing on working together under absolutely equal, transparent and clear conditions." End of quote. 1 year later, Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula and sent weapons and clandestinely soldiers to support the rebels in two southeastern provinces of Ukraine. Let's have a closer look at some of the claims. For centuries, Ukraine was under foreign rule, but, now quote Putin, "common spiritual values make us a single people," end of quote. This tells only one part of the story. With the arrival of Mongol troops in the mid-13th century, the land of the Rus was broken up. The western and southwestern parts, which constitute most of the territory of today's Ukraine and Belarus, was divided between the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Kingdom of Poland. Meanwhile, the northern and northeastern parts, the heartland of the later Russian state, stayed under Mongol rule. From the middle of the 13th until the middle of the 17th century, almost all the territory of today's Ukrainian state was not connected in any way with the Principality or Tsardom of Muscovy. It was part of the Catholic Grand Duchy of Lithuania or the Kingdom of Poland, which existed first as a personal and from 1569 on as a political union. The Ukrainian lands participated in all cultural and political developments in this crucial period of European history, while Muscovy did not. The Ukrainian lands experienced the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Counter-Reformation. Many of its cities, including Kiev, had local forms of self-administration based on German, in case of Kiev, Magdeburg law, something unheard of in the Tsardom of Muscovy. In this period, the East Slavs developed into three different groups, with different political cultures, traditions, and customs. The Tsardom of Muscovy had an autocratic ruler, while Poland-Lithuania developed into a state in which the nobility, and many of them were Ruthenians, that's another name for Ukrainians, dominated and had equal political rights. The respective spoken and written languages also started to develop in different directions. In the mid-17th century, Muscovite diplomats needed a translator to understand the Ukrainian spoken by the Zaporozhian Cossacks. After the fall of the Mongol Empire, the rulers of Muscovy set themselves the task of reconquering the land of the old Kievan Rus. The Grand Princes and Tsars of Moscow considered themselves to be the only and legitimate heir of the Grand Princes of Kiev. All land which once belonged to Kiev, they claimed to be theirs. In the mid-17th century, Poland-Lithuania experienced a deep political and military crisis, and over the next 120 years, the Tsar and his allies managed to destroy the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And Russia annexed about 80% of the territory of today's Ukraine. About 20% of the territory in the southwest around Lviv and Chernivtsi, however, never became part of the Russian Empire. How Peter the Great started to call the Tsardom of Muscovy, to also make, by using the name Rus, clear that he sees himself and sees Moscow as the legitimate heir of the Kievan Rus. In 2021, Putin turned historian again and wrote an essay on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. He considered it, quote, a great common misfortune and tragedy that a wall has emerged in recent years between Russia and Ukraine, between the parts of what is essentially the same historical and spiritual place, end of quote. He implied that Russia's enemies were trying to, again, Putin, sow discord among people, the overarching goal being to divide and to pit the parts of a single people against one another, end of quote. You see always this reference to Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians to be a single people. But last year, or 2 years ago, 2021, there was no longer any mention of Ukrainians being allowed to make their own choices. Fast forward to the 21st of February 2022, a few days before the Russian attack on Ukraine. Putin again emphasized that, quote, Ukraine is not just a neighboring country for us. It is an inalienable part of our own history, culture, and spiritual space. These are our comrades, those dearest to us, not only colleagues, friends, and people who once served together, but also relatives, people bound by blood, by family ties, end of quote. Putin believes that Ukrainians have been alienated from their true identity as a result of centuries of foreign rule and brainwashing. For him, Ukrainians are a 19th, early 20th century invention of Russia's then enemies, Austria-Hungary, the Poles, and the German Empire. In his view, these powers encouraged the Ukrainian national movement with the aim of weakening Russia, a strategy which Putin considers is now being continued by the West, meaning by the USA, NATO, and the European Union. Again, these claims are wrong. The modern Ukrainian national movement began in the first half of the 19th century with a center in the Russian Empire, Kharkiv and Kiev. The dominant Ukrainian national narrative of the time saw Ukrainians as the true heirs of the Kievan Rus. There is a strong emphasis in Ukrainian political thinking and in Ukrainian historiography on the continuity of the people. Many call themselves Russini or were called Ruthenians, living on the territory of the Kievan Rus. Ukrainians consider themselves to be the descendants of those people. And Ukrainian historians also claim that Ukrainian traditions of statehood exist. They consider the kingdom of Galicia-Volhynia in western Ukraine, and not Moscow, to be the true successor of the Kievan Rus. Ukrainians also claim a share of the Grand Principality of Lithuania, where the court language was called Slavonic, a language which is close to modern Belarusian. Ukrainians also claim a share of the, and they view the Cossack, so the Ukrainians also view the Cossack hetmanate of Bogdan Khmelnytsky in the middle of the 17th century as the first attempt to create a genuinely Ukrainian state. The Russian Revolution in 1917 was followed by more Ukrainian attempts to get an independent state which failed. The attitude of the Bolsheviks towards Ukraine was ambivalent, but at least in contrast to the Russian Empire, the Bolsheviks recognized Ukrainians as a separate nation, distinct from the Russian nation. The Soviet Union was founded in 1922 and consisted of several republics. The largest republic was the Russian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic. Today's Russian Federation is its successor. The Ukrainians also had their own republic, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic. But neither of the two states was independent. Instead, they formed part of the Soviet Union, which was held together by the dictatorship of the Communist Party. The Soviet government tried to distance itself, so the early Soviet governments, tried to distance themselves from the repressive nationality policy of the Russian Empire and promoted the Ukrainian language and Ukrainian culture in Soviet Ukraine. That's where Putin's statement about Ukraine as a creation of Lenin comes from. This moderately positive policy towards Ukraine changed in the 1930s. For Stalin's taste, Ukrainian Bolsheviks had become too nationalistic, and they were put into prison or executed. Collectivization and decolonization hit Ukraine hard, resulting in a famine in which at least 4 million Ukrainians perished. Today, many historians, but not all, view the famine as an attempt to destroy the Ukrainian nation, viewing it as a genocide. Something which Putin also often uses as justification for the Russian attack is the concept that today's Ukraine is ruled by fascists, and that Ukrainian nationalism is intimately linked to National Socialism. Again, this is wrong, but there are reasons why this idea is so popular in Russia. As a result of the German-Soviet Treaty of August 1939, those parts of Ukraine which had never previously been part of the Russian Empire came under Soviet control. The Soviet occupation of then Eastern Poland, today Western Ukraine and Western Belarus, led to mass arrests, deportations, and executions. The Ukrainian nationalists, who were concentrated in this part of Ukraine, fought against Sovietization and allied themselves temporarily with Nazi Germany. The most influential organization was the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, or OUN. This organization consisted of integral nationalists who had embraced fascism in the 1930s and early 1940s. In the summer of 1941, they participated in anti-Semitic pogroms and later fought against the Polish presence in Western Ukraine by murdering tens of thousands of Polish civilians living in the region. These Ukrainian nationalists continued their fight even after Germany had been expelled from Ukraine. The last units only surrendered in the early 1950s. And between 1944 and 1947, the Soviet authorities killed about 100,000 Ukrainians who were resisting Sovietization, and many more were deported. Especially in Western Ukrainian society, members of the OUN are remembered first and foremost as anti-Soviet resistance fighters, while in Russia they are denounced as Nazis and German collaborators. In the Ukrainian protests and revolutions of 2004 and 2014, groups placing themselves in the tradition of the OUN played a visible role. But in parliamentary elections since then, no right-wing party in Ukraine has managed to get more than 5% of the vote. The Soviet victory in the Second World War brought one big gain for modern Ukraine. It brought almost all the lands where the majority of the population was Ukrainian into the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic. But this united Ukraine was part of the repressive Soviet Union, and the important decisions were made in Moscow. After the war, more Russians moved to Ukraine as workers and administrators, and Russian culture and the Russian language permeated Ukraine. This process of gradual Russification has a long tradition, but accelerated in the 1970s. In central and eastern Ukraine, especially in towns and cities, you often heard more Russian than Ukrainian being spoken. This went so far that in the 1980s, Ukrainian culture and the Ukrainian language were under severe threat. The first Ukrainian state-building attempts between 1918 and 1920 had failed, but in 1991, the overwhelming majority of the population of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic voted for Ukrainian independence. The support for independence was lowest in Crimea at 54%, but even there, the majority still voted for an independent Ukraine. For Ukraine, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was a blessing. As you might know, Putin considers it a tragedy. Ukraine eventually became an independent country but struggled. Corruption was widespread, and a few oligarchs got richer and richer while the country continued to be dependent on Moscow. Russia's war against Ukraine is part of Putin's attempt to fight against processes of decolonization and disintegration of empires, which the German Empire, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, the Spanish, British, French, and Portuguese empires had gone through between half a century and a century earlier. Putin sees the Soviet Union as the state which preserved the Russian Empire and through which Russia exercised its power. This was originally not the intention of those making the revolution in November 1917. I would argue that in 1991, the empire, whether in Russian or Soviet form, had become anachronistic. Without the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 bringing a party to power with a universalist, socialist, supranational ideology, the Russian Empire would have disintegrated earlier, probably already in 1918. Lenin's clever nationality policy and the creation of a union of socialist Soviet republics allowed the new state to hold on to most of the territory of the Russian Empire. Lenin saw in Great Russian chauvinism the greatest danger for the Soviet Union, and he tried to contain it. But it re-emerged under Stalin. In the 1930s, Stalin considered the nationalism of the non-Russians as a greater danger for the Soviet Union than Russian nationalism. Despite being a Georgian, he promoted Russian nationalism by trying to reconcile it with socialist internationalism. Putin is very much in the tradition of Stalin, but without the socialist internationalism. His Russian nationalism is an unappealing ideology which is utterly unattractive to anyone not identifying as Russian. It is also unattractive for many Russians. So where did it all go wrong for Putin? Over the last 20 years, Russia's and Ukraine's paths diverged. Russia got more and more authoritarian. Putin undermined and has now destroyed civil society in Russia. The more Ukraine moved towards Europe and the more stable Ukrainian democracy became, the more demanding, authoritarian, dictatorial became Russia. Ukrainians are now used to elect or change their presidents and governments as they please. They give sometimes one and sometimes another party the majority in the parliament. The level of corruption is still high, but President Zelensky is working hard to control it. If the government in power, the Ukrainian government in power, tries to rig elections, there are mass protests, which in 2003-04, in the Orange Revolution, forced a repetition of the presidential elections. In 2013-14, mass protests brought down the corrupt President Yanukovych. He was democratically elected, but had lost the support of the population. Putin claims that it was a coup of Ukrainian Nazis, instigated and supported by the US and the EU. In reality, it was a revolution following spontaneous mass protests in Kiev and many other Ukrainian cities and towns, which Yanukovych tried to suppress by force. The democratically elected parliament took over after the president had fled the country, and soon after elections were called, which were free and equal, and led to the election of a new president, Poroshenko, and of a new parliament. Poroshenko lost the next elections, when the overwhelming majority of the population eventually voted for Volodymyr Zelensky, the current president. So it is clear that today's Ukraine is not ruled by a gang who came to power by a Nazi coup or by any coup. Those in power are the democratically elected representatives of the Ukrainian people. Ukrainians, other than Russians, have tasted democracy. Or rather, Ukrainians have tasted democracy and, other than Russians, want to keep it. The mass protests in winter 2013 followed the decision of President Yanukovych not to sign a free trade agreement with the EU. Putin had offered Yanukovych to buy 15 billion worth of Eurobonds issued by Ukraine and lower gas prices if he would not sign the treaty with the European Union. Putin envisioned a Eurasian Economic Union under Russian leadership, in which he wanted to include Ukraine. But Ukrainians, in their overwhelming majority, saw and see their place in Europe, not in a Russian-led Eurasian Union or a Russian world dominated by a revisionist, imperialist Russia, which desperately tries to reverse the collapse of the empire and restore its hegemony over Ukraine and other neighboring states. Before 2014, Putin seemed to have aimed for a Belarus-like status for Ukraine, without formally annexing Ukrainian territory. Preferred option was indirect control over all of Ukraine. He was more than happy to provide support for a weak authoritarian leader ruling over divided Ukraine. The successful democratic revolution in Kiev, the Euromaidan, made him snap, and he annexed Ukrainian Crimea. He did not annex yet the rebel territories in Luhansk and Donetsk. The idea was to keep Ukraine weak, to make it a failed state, to undermine the unity of the Ukrainian nation by keeping the conflict simmering, by forcing Ukraine to fight a war against these rebels without being able to fully re-establish Ukrainian sovereignty. Any territorial gain and progress from Ukrainian troops would just be countered by more Russian military support for the rebels and by sending covertly or openly Russian soldiers and weapons to the region. The Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014 and Russia's military support of the pro-Russian rebels in eastern Ukraine did not have the effect Putin had expected. He thought that it would destabilize Ukraine, that Ukrainians would be divided and eventually accept being ruled indirectly by Moscow. Contrary to his expectations, however, his aggression has led to a much greater national unity in Ukraine, while simultaneously making it obvious to everyone that the current Russian regime is an enemy of Ukrainian independence. Because of Putin's actions, the identification with Ukraine in all Ukrainian regions has grown even stronger than they were before. 2014 also intensified the attempts being made in Ukraine to reduce the influence of the Russian language. Many Ukrainians are at least bilingual, and about 30%, including President Zelensky, have Russian as their first language. There are many families where one parent is Ukrainian and the other is Russian. Putin wanted to exploit the presence of so many Russian speakers. He presented Russia as the protector of their interests and used supposed violations of these interests to justify his interference in the internal affairs of Ukraine. The Ukrainian parliament and government pursued a policy which Putin could exploit propagandistically. The parliament passed and the president signed laws stopping Russian being the second state language in some regions by allowing Russian language newspapers only to be published if they also had a Ukrainian language edition, and by pushing to replace Russian language schools by Ukrainian language schools. From a Ukrainian perspective, these were defensive measures, which aimed to reduce Russian cultural influence in Ukraine and push back the potential influence of a state, Russia, which had just annexed part of Ukrainian territory and was clearly aiming to destabilize the country. To illustrate the cultural Russian influence, a study from 2012 showed that on Ukrainian radio, only 3.4% of songs were in Ukrainian and 60% were in Russian. More than 60% of newspapers, 83% of journals, and 87% of books were in Russian. On television, only 28% of programs were in Ukrainian. More and more of those with Russian as their first language gravitated now away from the aggressor. Instead of weakening Putin's aggression in 2014, it strengthened Ukrainian democracy and the wish to move out of the Russian sphere of influence, become a member of the European Union, and to increase security against Russia by becoming a member of NATO. But NATO membership was not on the cards, as long as the conflict in Donetsk and Luhansk provinces and over Crimea was not solved. NATO does not admit members which have unresolved territorial conflicts. Russia has an enormous arsenal of nuclear weapons. No state would dare to violate the recognized borders of the Russian Federation. The unresolved issue of Crimea and the war in eastern Ukraine made Ukrainian NATO membership, if not impossible, but highly unlikely. Putin could delay it as long as he wished. Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and Putin did not like it that NATO admitted those countries which had previously been in the Soviet sphere of influence in Europe. German, British, and US leaders gave some verbal assurances in the run-up to German unification that NATO did not intend to expand beyond the German borders. These assurances were given to Gorbachev, the Soviet leader. But then the Soviet Union collapsed, which created a new international environment. The Russian Federation was the main successor state of the Soviet Union, taking on many obligations but also many assets of the Soviet Union, including the whole nuclear arsenal. Ukraine surrendered the nuclear weapons on its territory to Russia, and Russia signed a treaty recognizing the inviolability of Ukrainian borders. Many states previously belonging to the Soviet Union or being in the Soviet sphere of influence did not hesitate to apply for NATO membership, having just escaped the control of an oppressive imperialist power. They wanted to ensure that a resurgent, revisionist Russia would not try to re-establish its dominance. Just have a look at the history of Poland, of Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia in the last few hundred years, and you understand why they tried to join NATO, and they were right to do so. One wing of the neo-realist school of international relations, the proponents of offensive realism, believe that great powers are revisionist, trying to maximize their power and try to dominate the international system. They have a point. Putin thinks in spheres of influence. But they also conclude that it does not make sense to question that strong powers impose their will over their neighbors. This is just a given. One of the most influential proponents, the US political scientist John Mersheimer, published in 2015 an article arguing that the Ukraine crisis was the West's fault. If NATO had not expanded, Putin would not have annexed Crimea, was the argument. NATO violated the sphere of interest Russia claimed for itself. To be fair to Mersheimer, in 1993, he advised Ukraine to keep its share of Soviet nuclear weapons, as he expected that Russia would eventually try to revise the borders. This thinking of spheres of influence implies that the security and political interests of powerful states trump the security and interests of smaller and less powerful states. This means that, for example, the 1.3 million Estonians don't have the right to pursue an independent foreign policy and choose their alliances. Some experts argue that NATO should have rejected all applications for joining the NATO from countries which used to belong to the Soviet Union, or which the Russian government considered to be in the Russian sphere of influence. This position comes dangerously close to defending imperialism and colonialism, and undermines the sovereignty of states and the right of self-determination. NATO expanded because the new members were desperate to join the alliance. By the way, Germany and France vetoed in 2008 that Ukraine would get a clear perspective of NATO membership. They did not want to alienate Russia. I think it was a mistake. And before the invasion, the French president and the German chancellor made it absolutely clear to Putin that there were no plans to accept Ukraine's application to become a NATO member in the foreseeable future. What they could not promise is that it would never happen. Before the Russian attack on Ukraine, NATO did not have a strong presence in the new member states. There were no more than 5,000 soldiers under direct control of NATO. And the USA did not place weapon systems which Russia might have considered a threat. Before 2014, NATO forces in Europe have never been weaker. After 1991, the USA and Britain dramatically reduced their military presence in Europe. Germany abolished military conscription, and the German army still suffers from many years of underfunding. In 2019, during Trump's term in office, French President Macron declared that Europe could no longer rely on being defended by the USA. He declared NATO to have suffered brain death. US President Trump pulled more troops out of Europe and even considered to dissolve NATO. So I hope I could show that the NATO enlargement was not a threat to Russia's security. It is not NATO which tries to reverse international recognized borders, but Russia. Russia's territorial integrity is not threatened by NATO or its neighbors. But there is a difference between objectively not being a threat and the perception that there is one. Did or does Putin believe that it is NATO's and the West's objective to destroy Russia? If you read Putin's public statements over the last 20 years, you will see that for a long time he was not unduly worried about NATO. Putin knew that NATO was no threat to the security of the Russian Federation and that Russia's borders are safe. He is now trading on conspiracy theories. The West and NATO had always conspired to weaken and eventually destroy Russia. He may now even believe in these conspiracy theories, but he did not see it that way 10 or 20 years ago. In 2000 he said that, quote, "It is with difficulty that I imagine NATO as an enemy," end of quote. 1 year later, quote, "If we change the format of relationship between Russia and NATO, then I think NATO enlargement will cease to be an issue, will no longer be a relevant issue," end of quote. When Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania applied for NATO membership, Putin stated, quote, "We of course are not in a position to tell people what to do. We cannot forbid people to make certain choices if they want to increase the security of their nations in a particular way," end of quote. In May 2002, asked about Ukraine's future relations to NATO, he replied, quote, "I am absolutely convinced that Ukraine will not shy away from the processes of expanding interaction with NATO and the Western allies. As a whole, Ukraine has its own relations with NATO. There is the Ukraine-NATO Council. At the end of the day, the decision is to be taken by NATO and Ukraine. It is a matter for those two partners," end of quote. Even in 2010, at the NATO summit in Lisbon, Medvedev, who temporarily had replaced Putin as president, said, quote, "We view the future with optimism and will work on developing relations between Russia and NATO in all areas," end of quote. Putin now says that it was also NATO expansion which made him attack. In his rambling speech marking the first anniversary of the Russian attack on Ukraine, Putin stated that, quote, "The people of Ukraine have become hostages of the Kiev regime and its Western handlers. The West is using Ukraine as a battering ram against Russia and as a testing range." End of quote. The West plans, again quotes, "to finish us once and for all in a policy which it traces back," end of quote, "which it traces back for decades, if not for centuries. If the invasion of Ukraine was meant to improve the security for Russia and weakening NATO, the attack was a strategic blunder of gigantic proportions. The Russian attack on Ukraine rejuvenated NATO and gave it a new purpose. Following the wishes of Poland, the Baltic republics and others, NATO increased and will increase its presence on their territories. There are now, a couple of months ago, 40,000 NATO soldiers stationed in the new member states to deter Russia. Sweden and Finland have thrown their policy of military non-alignment overboard and tried to join NATO. Finland, in the meantime, has joined NATO. Germany decided to strengthen its army, which in the current state would not be capable of fighting a war. Finland and Sweden, Poland and Lithuania, Estonia or Romania are not afraid of the USA or militarily stronger Germany. They are afraid of Russia and see in NATO membership the only way to protect the security of their countries and integrity of their borders. If Putin wanted to weaken NATO and reduce the threat, which was in a case purely imagined, but not even imagined by Putin 20 years ago or 15 years ago, he achieved the opposite. The only explanation I can think of for these contradictions is that the current obsession with NATO is a smokescreen and serves the purpose to give the Russian aggression a defensive note. Putin says now that Russia was under mortal threat by NATO and that they had to act. He justifies the attack as a preventative war, and quite a few experts, intellectuals and politicians on the far left and far right have fallen for it. I don't know what Putin really thought in 2000, 2003 or 2013 about Ukraine. He certainly expressed publicly a more differentiated view than he does now. But since a few years, his stand against Ukraine became more and more aggressive. And most of his verbal attacks on Ukraine are not related to a possible NATO membership. He accuses Ukraine of having planned to commit genocide in Donetsk and Luhansk, an absurd accusation, and following the pattern of accusing the enemy of what Russia is doing. Putin and the people around him refuse to accept that Russia does not have the power to impose its will on half of Europe. It is militarily still powerful and an important energy supplier, but it is economically weak, with a GDP equivalent, I think even lower than that of Italy. Russia refuses to accept that the time of empires, including that of the Russian Empire, is over. Britain and France, Germany and Spain, Turkey and Japan, they are all still important powers, but they are no longer empires. The earlier this lesson is learned, the better for the Russians and the better for everyone. I would love to see a Russian government seriously trying to improve the life of its citizens, instead of pursuing dreams of empire which only brings suffering and destruction. Then, why do some Western experts defend Putin, show understanding for his position, and believe the West and NATO enlargement are partly responsible for the Russian attack? So a short digression about experts. Allow me to speculate a bit. In general, experts prefer not to change their views. To admit an error would mean that they would have to re-evaluate what they said and published in the past. More specifically, there is a sort of identity crisis of those who studied, researched and taught Russian and Soviet history, often since several decades. Some changed their approach under the impression of the Russian attack. Others stuck to their old, obsolete pattern of interpretations. Quite a few historians of Russia used to admire Putin and saw in him the right man to lead Russia. A strong man, they said, was needed to hold this large state together. If Putin was not there, everything would end in chaos and a rogue government would get control of nuclear weapons. One of my German colleagues once wrote that we should be grateful for Putin, as he prevents Russia from sliding into chaos and violence, which would be much more dangerous for Europe than having to put up with an authoritarian Russian government. The strong man in Russia seemed to guarantee stability. In Germany, These people are called Putin-Versteher, those who understand Putin. It's meant in an ironic way. There's also some sort of anti-NATO reflex, which was triggered especially in the European left. Many experts did not realize that Putin's views evolved. He got more and more caught in conspiracy theories, a rejection of reality, wishful thinking, and an ideologically deformed view of the Russian past and the present. He developed and expressed a worldview which strongly resembles pre-war fascism. The way he exercises power moves in the same direction. In the moment, still more resembling fascist Italy than Nazi Germany, but he is not finished yet. To conclude, I argue that the Russian attack on Ukraine is not the result of Ukrainian attempts to join NATO or a belated response to the enlargement of NATO. The threat is imaginary and a pretext for different aims. It is a result of Putin's policy of trying to bring Ukraine back under Russian control, his fear of democracy, and an ideology, the idea of the Russian world, which has strong fascist undertones. Putin's ideology shapes his take on Russian and Ukrainian history. He distorts and manipulates history to justify the attack on Ukraine. Along with many members of the Russian political elite, Putin shares the view that it's not in the Russian interest to allow Ukraine leave Russia's sphere of influence. He denies the existence of the Ukrainian nation and therefore rejects its right of self-determination. Instead, he wants to absorb Ukrainians and Ukraine in the Russian world. In this context, however, references to a common history and shared cultural features are irrelevant, as the overwhelming majority of people in Ukraine have decided that they prefer to live in a democratic and independent Ukrainian state rather than in a Russian-sponsored dictatorship. If this were not true, Ukrainian resistance would have collapsed long ago, or as Lesser Romechuk phrased it recently in Japan, even if Ukraine would have fallen from heaven in 1991. Still, no reason and no justification for violating its borders. Putin and with him many Russians suffer from imperial phantom pain. They did not come to terms with the end of the empire in its Soviet form and refuse to accept that the world, Europe and Ukraine have moved on. Putin wants Russia to be an empire. His nostalgic feelings for the Soviet Union have nothing to do with sympathies for socialism. He sees the Soviet Union as a state in which Russia was able to express its power and establish its hegemony over Eastern Europe. For Russia, this war is an imperialist war with a genocidal component. For Ukraine, it is a war of decolonization, for democracy and national self-determination. I don't have doubts that Russia and Ukraine would have much better relations if Russia were a democratic country. Before the attack in February 2022, Putin accused Ukraine of committing a genocide against the population living in those regions controlled by pro-Russian rebels in Luhansk and Donetsk, controlled by the Kremlin. There was no genocide. Measures against the use of the Russian language, whether you disagree with these measures or not, cannot justify the attack on a sovereign country. The Ukrainian army held the front to prevent the pro-Russian rebels to take even more Ukrainian land, and they managed to contain them. What is worrying that a considerable part of the Russian population seems to have bought into Putin's delusions and ideology and believes the propaganda reiterated daily in the Russian media that Russia itself is under threat. Russians who protest against the war are arrested, mistreated, lose their jobs, have left the country or are in the process of leaving. All in all, the Russian attack on Ukraine was a political mistake and strategic error which achieved the exact opposite it was meant to achieve. It brought the so-called West together, strengthened NATO, weakened Russia, united Ukraine, and alienated Russians and Ukrainians, possibly for the next few generations. The best outcome of this war, not only for Ukraine and for Europe, but also for Russia itself, is a decisive Ukrainian victory.